It's Saturday, 3 o'clock, 4 minutes after the hour. I'm Steve Rinehart. I'm your host. You're with K-Talk AM 630, the voice of Utah, Utah's oldest continually broadcasting radio station. K-Talk's been live and broadcasting since 1965. It's actually the second, maybe it's the third oldest talk radio station in the entire United States of America. We're happy to bring you issues of culture, history, politics, religion, perspective on events that you probably aren't getting from the major networks. We often on this show try to begin with local issues and the news, move on to international or national and then international issues. We try to have on local politicians and sometimes professors, authors. We're going to be getting into the presidential race and state-by-state polls a little bit later in the show. The election, of course, is Tuesday, and we're going to be talking about which states are toss-ups, which states are leaning Republican, Democrat, and how the whole thing's likely to shake out. But I want to begin the show by introducing to you a new company that may play a role in presidential politics in the future. And this company has just launched in the last couple of days, and I've got an individual associated with the company here with us on the air. I'm going to go to him in just a minute. The company is TruthSerum. TruthSerum LLC. It's a Utah company, and you can find them online at TruthSerum.com. Now, what they have done, and Chris Brown will be with us in just a moment, but I'm going to try and summarize what they're doing in my own words and let him get into the technical details down the road. But they're doing word analysis. Specifically, right now they're analyzing written communications, written text from individuals, and they're trying to identify personality traits that a person has based just on what they're writing. For instance, someone who is an introvert writes a little differently than someone who's an extrovert. People who have certain criminal proclivities write in a way that these proclivities can be identified from their written communications. People who are generous, people who are honest, they combine words differently. Their personality bleeds through in their written text. And so TruthSerum provides a way for people to analyze written communications of others and try to identify what personality traits they might have. Now, you can imagine that this would be very beneficial to, for instance, a young woman who's considering going out with a guy and runs his Facebook communications through this software. Even in a presidential election, you could identify the personality traits of one candidate versus the other. And so let's go to Chris Brown now. He's got more of the details. Let me go to our guest line here. Hold on just one moment. Chris, are you there?
Yes, I'm here.
Thank you for being with us. I apologize for my crude introduction of your company, TruthSerum, but I think it's very interesting what you're doing, and I want our listeners to be exposed to it. I know you just barely launched. Tell us, did I do a good job explaining what TruthSerum does? Can you give us a little better description of what it is that you're doing?
I think you did a pretty good job. The basics are this. Whenever anyone communicates with another person, they make subtle subconscious decisions about the language that they use. And those subtle subconscious decisions happen so quickly and so automatically that it's very difficult for people to manipulate those things. And so one of the exciting things about analyzing written communication to identify personality and behavioral traits is that it takes a great deal of effort for someone to actually suppress those underlying traits and the way that they come through in their communication. And I think that there are a couple of simple ways of just explaining this. And, all of us kind of know someone who maybe gives us a compliment, but after they give us the compliment, it doesn't really sound like a compliment. Well, oftentimes that's because of the way they structured the compliment. Yeah, there could have been a compliment buried in there somewhere, but the other language that they used when they were conveying that just didn't seem quite right. And what we've been able to do is using computer algorithms, we're able to analyze the way communication is structured and infer the various personality traits of the individuals who created that communication. And we are able to look at some other things as well when we look at social network activity, such as what things they like and how many friends they have, and some other things that give us a little bit of insight.
So 3 questions for you. What kind of communications do you analyze? What kind of traits can you identify, and how accurate use your system for doing this?
So really, you could analyze any kind of communication. You could analyze people talking to one another, and there are linguistic researchers who analyze almost every kind of communication. We decided to focus upon social network activity because our feeling is that people have effectively already put a tremendous amount of data out there that's available to be analyzed, and that was something that was readily available, it was accessible, and people often have access to it. But you could do the same thing with letters, with emails. You could analyze speeches. The key thing is that we try to not mix types of communication. So, for example, if I were to compare someone who wrote a letter to someone who was giving a speech, that's not a good comparison because they're different types of communication.
Are the equations you use, the algorithms, different for written communication versus oral?
There are some different characteristics of oral communication. So, for example, people often repeat themselves in oral communication. So the frequencies of certain words may be a lot higher in oral communication because someone's trying to get a point across. But if they were to write that same message, they wouldn't necessarily do that. And so the way we have to weight the different words is different in written communication than oral communication. So you could do the same process, you just have to use different math.
What kind of traits can you identify? Can you tell if someone's a thief, if they're a murderer, if they're honest, dishonest?
I can't tell if someone's a murderer, although there may be a time when we're able to get pretty close to identifying people who have some very scary traits. I always like to talk about the underlying personality traits rather than what you might call the end state behaviors. Because someone can have a trait, or as you mentioned earlier, a proclivity for something, and they can, because they understand that trait would lead to some socially undesirable outcome, work really hard at controlling that. So you may have someone who has a really high internal bias, you might say, towards narcissism, but because they've learned socially that narcissism turns people off, they work really hard at controlling that. So on the site right now, there's two different kinds of analysis.
And this is on TruthSerum.com for our listeners to feel like going there.
TruthSerum.com. There's two different types of analysis right now. The first is what's called a 5-factor analysis, and these 5 factors are the first one is called openness to experience, which sort of roughly gives you a measure of someone's mental flexibility. It also gives you a rough idea of intelligence. Generally, more intelligent people will score higher for that. The next trait is conscientiousness. This has to do with how well someone meets their responsibilities, follows through, does what they say they were going to do. The next trait is extroversion, which is actually exactly what it sounds like. The degree to which someone is outgoing. Agreeableness, which is how cooperative and sympathetic someone is. So we usually don't tend to like people who get low scores for agreeableness. They're not usually someone who we might consider to be friendly. And then a really interesting one called neuroticism, which is the degree to which someone is able to control their emotions. So someone who has a high score for neuroticism doesn't have good emotional control. So if we're looking for a leader, for example, we would want someone who has a relatively low score on a trait like neuroticism because we don't want them, freaking out in the middle of the night and pushing the big red button. The other set of traits that we have on the site right now are what are called the dark triad of traits. And the dark triad is really interesting because these are actually all things that are viewed negatively. On the 5 factors, those aren't really negative or positive. Everyone has a combination of those factors. But the dark triad, these are things that most of us would view as being negative characteristics. And so the first is Machiavellianism, which is the degree to which someone wants to control or manipulate others. The next is narcissism, which is the degree to which they think they're self-important. And the final is psychopathy, which is sort of their lack of constraint or restraint in their personality. So if you go on the site and you analyze your social network activity, it's going to give you some measurements on these. It's also going to match you up with some different famous and infamous persons who we've conducted similar analyses of.
So what have you found out from conducting these analyses of famous people? Who should we be suspicious of in history?
Well, there are certainly people who have traits that maybe we don't care for, and we'd look at suspicious of them. I mean, for example, when we do the analysis of famous criminals, that's sort of one of the interesting sort of analyses that we can do, and we've got some famous criminals in there. So, for example, we've got Jeffrey Dahmer.
Oh, jeez.
So, Jeffrey Dahmer, interestingly enough, his most prominent trait is narcissism. Now, that doesn't mean that every narcissistic person is going to run out and become a serial killer, but it does give you some insight into the sort of internal mental processes that are going on with someone like that. And even if a highly narcissistic person doesn't go out and murder someone, they're still not a lot of fun to be around. So that's something that people might like to know. And then we also, of course, find that agreeableness is something that we often see that various nefarious characters don't have in abundance. It's really interesting when you look at politicians, because most politicians are pretty similar. In fact, we've got a little application on the site right now that allows you to compare yourself to our two presidential candidates. And the thing that surprises people is that if you look at these two individuals on a personality level, they're nearly identical. Their personalities are incredibly similar. Now, of course, there's important policy differences between them, and there's a reason that people choose one over the other when they're voting. But from a personality standpoint, they're surprisingly similar.
That's interesting.
And that often surprises people. But if you step back for a moment, the characteristics that make someone a successful politician are going to be relatively similar characteristics, even if that person has a different political ideology. But then you have the real outliers, like Ronald Reagan. His personality is very different from most other politicians.
How so?
Well, he was incredibly low for neuroticism, so he had incredible emotional control. So when he was in Reykjavik and he was looking across the desk at Gorbachev and said, well, why don't we get rid of all nuclear weapons? He was able to do that because of that incredible degree of emotional control and self-confidence he had because of that. He was also highly extroverted. That's why he was able to get along with Tip O'Neill, because even where there was someone who he disagreed with politically, the high extroversion allowed him to focus upon other people and have a good relationship with those people, even when, maybe they didn't see eye to eye politically. Then if we look at other people like Franklin Delano Roosevelt, he had an incredibly high score for Machiavellianism. And if you look at the things that he did during that period, he did a lot of things that structurally changed the country. And so it wasn't necessarily nefarious, but he had the internal characteristics where when he saw something and he thought it needed to be changed, he was just going to do it. So it is interesting to look at politicians. In our case right now, Governor Romney and President Obama are incredibly similar in almost every trait. And I think it's interesting when you look at the graphics on the site, you can see how close they really are.
Now, how do users use the site? I assume there's a fee to have these different communications analyzed.
Well, right now, everything that's on the site is free. We are going to be offering some more sophisticated products in the future that will be fee-based. But right now, it's mostly just a matter of logging into the site, linking it to your social networks. So when you go to TruthSerum.com and you start to use the site, it's going to ask you to either link to your Facebook account or your Twitter account. The reason it does that is because that's where it pulls the initial data from to develop a personality profile on you. After you've developed a profile on you, you then have the opportunity to go and run an analysis against your friends.
I see.
Or people who you subscribe to on Twitter.
Listen, Chris, we've got to take a quick 2-minute commercial break. Can you stay with us for just a minute?
Sure.
We'll wrap this interview up when we get back in just a moment. I'm Steve Rinehart. You're with K-Talk, talking to Chris Brown about TruthSerum.com. I'll tell you about it when we get back. Finish this interview. Back in just a moment. Please stay tuned. Welcome back. I'm Steve Rinehart. I'm your host here with K-Talk AM 630, the voice of Utah, Utah's oldest continually broadcasting radio station. Happy to be with you here on this beautiful Saturday afternoon. The phone numbers, if you feel like calling into the station, we may take some calls a little later on. 801-254-5855 in Salt Lake, Provo 470-5855, Ogden 670-5855. Actually, the Provo and Ogden numbers have now been consolidated into the Salt Lake number. So if you're in Provo or Ogden, call the 254-5855 line. Let's go back to our guest, Chris Brown. Chris has been telling us about TruthSerum.com. It's a website that he's involved with that analyzes communications to identify personality traits, the personality traits of the author. Chris, I'm sorry for that interruption. These commercial breaks pop up on us here.
No problem.
But so you were saying that users can go to the site, they can have their own communications analyzed, and then they can analyze communications of others.
That's correct, and I think that might be one of the most interesting applications because I think that we meet so many people today, and almost immediately one of the first things that some people do is they either subscribe to their Twitter feed or friend them on Facebook so that they can sort of check a person out. And oftentimes we do that in a very subjective way by looking at their photographs and reading some things that they've linked to. And with our system at TruthSerum.com, you can actually get sort of an objective analysis of that person. Now, this is an analysis of their personality traits, and none of this necessarily directly means that they're going to do a particular behavior, although we're getting closer to being able to predict behaviors. But it certainly can give you a better feel for somebody. Maybe that person who you met seemed really nice at first, but after you analyze them, you find out they have some characteristics that you're not really crazy about, and if nothing else, it can give you a little bit of caution.
So you hope to get to the point where you could, for instance, analyze Lindsay Lohan's communications and tell that she's a drunk and is going to get in 5 car accidents a year.
Well, there
you may be able to get that far.
Correlations for that, yeah. There are, for example, personality traits that do strongly predict things like substance abuse. I don't want to do that on the site yet because we want to collect more data, but it's not that far off.
Well, so what kind of response do you expect from the site? Do you think people will be outraged that you're making maybe in some cases negative predictions or characterizations of their personality?
My wife is ashamed to tell people what I do. I
think it's interesting.
It's one of those things that I guess it depends on your perspective, right? You're not breaking into anyone's email. You're not going through their trash. You're analyzing data that they've already put out there and made public. And if someone puts something out in the public domain, I think it's pretty okay for people to analyze that.
That's fair game.
It's some people might find it to be a little bit creepy, but that's the internet. I think the entire internet has gotten pretty creepy. So,
well, I would encourage our listeners to visit the site TruthSerum.com. You've just barely launched it, and it is a Utah company, although you are working with the company from Florida, and we will post this interview on the website and make it available to people. I think it's fascinating what you're doing, Chris, and I wish we had more time to talk about it today, but we'll have you back on and see how things are going down the road.
All right.
And
thank you.
I appreciate it very much. Take care of yourself down there, and don't forget to vote next week.
All right. Thank you. All right. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Chris. Have a wonderful afternoon. That was Chris Brown. And again, that website is TruthSerum.com. So you can go there and find it. We'll post a link to it on the website, StephenReinhart.com. This show, along with